the news and in a lot of research coming out that people are seeking jobs with meaning and purpose and where they can make a social impact overall across the board, despite sector, despite industry, especially millennials and Gen Z. 89% of millennials would reject a job if it didn't align with their social good values or something like that.
Hey everybody, it's Trevor Nelson with a friendly reminder to make sure that you subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. We really hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for coming. Talk to me. I know you do a lot of speaking. Tell us about the role you just left and what's new in your world. I think it's interesting.
So going back in time, I started a nonprofit when I was in college and spent my entire adult life growing and cultivating that organization and did a lot of great work that I'm really proud of. But earlier this year, I just determined it was time for me to try new things. And my last day as executive director of that organization, it's called Activate Good, was actually May 31st of this year.
Wow. So it's pretty fresh. Wow.
It is.
Talk to me about what y'all did. What was the mission? And tell the audience if you don't mind.
When I was in college, I went on a nearly 3-month-long road trip with my best friend. Her name's Heather. And we volunteered in over 20 states. And the whole purpose of this was to learn more about causes, what nonprofits needed, and also why people did or didn't get involved in their local communities, like what barriers were in their way to getting involved and volunteering.
That's a really good thesis.
Yeah. You go out there and you're like, it must be because they don't care. But that's not what we found. What we found is people do care, but getting involved is actually a little harder than you would think. There's a gazillion opportunities on the internet, but how do you know which ones are the right ones for you? Or if you don't know how to, search or investigate through the ecosystem at all, how do you even begin? So we went on this road trip, learned people wanted to get involved, but were facing barriers to do so. And when we got home to Raleigh, North Carolina, a couple months later, we wanted to start an organization that would remove those barriers to getting involved. So Activate Good was born, and we inspired people to volunteer in our community. And since I started the organization, we've tracked at least 50,000 people that we've been able to activate to go volunteer. So
I love that.
That's the mission. That's the organization that I just left a couple months ago.
I love that. And listen, no judgment. You appear to be very young. How long ago did you start the organization when you were in college? How many years ago was this?
Let's just say it was about 2005.
Okay. Wow. So some time ago. Oh, good for you. Wow. A couple things. Amber Melanie Smith, thanks so much for coming. Really, really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. We're going to open up the whole Pandora's box of stuff we can talk about here. Very, very interesting because you found something where I feel like a couple things happened, especially now I want to ask you about the symmetry between volunteering and time, which is some folks' wealth. Of course, everyone actually, the greatest thing we can give to anyone is our time. But then also when it comes to accessing dollars with potential donors and what have you, I think of a couple of things. I think of one, I think when there's too many options, I think donors and volunteers, I'm going to ask you if there's symmetry there. I'm thinking that there is. Paralysis by analysis. There's just too many options. What do I do? What's going to speak to me and tie to my heartstrings? And then also removing friction and just making it like, in business, we talk about this all the time and we talk to nonprofits all the time. Let's remove friction. Let's remove these, quote unquote, choke points that stop people from accessing your organization to give their time and to give their money. So it sounds like that was like your thesis when you started it. And I'm assuming you're still preaching those same, you don't have to use my words, but the same premise, right? As like, let's make it easy for folks to find you. Let's make it easy for folks to give their time and their money, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. My mission with Activate Good was to remove barriers to volunteering. But now, my personal mission in my life and what prompted me to start Activate Good in the first place and what carries me forward even after Activate Good is I just want to make it easier for people to make a difference in the world, period. But people don't know the different options available to them. It could be working for or starting a nonprofit. It could be being a donor or philanthropist. It could be running for office. It could be volunteering. But people don't know how to assess necessarily which path is going to be the right fit for their personality and where they are in their lives. So when you're talking about volunteering and donating, the number one thing that we see time and time again is that connection to the people behind the cause, right? I'm sure you've seen the data. I'm preaching to the choir, but you are more likely to volunteer and you're more likely to donate when someone you know asks you to.
Now we're talking about the relationship
That's
piece.
right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit, like what you found or, advice that you can give or, we're constantly preaching relationships first. These things take time. Get ready for the long haul, the long game, whatever you want to call it. I mean, double up on your patience, quadruple down on your patience, that kind of thing. But yeah, let's talk about that a little bit just so folks can have more context about how important it is that if you know someone or connect with someone, you're willing to give and want to work with them and invest in their organization, invest your time as well.
Yeah. And you might look at that and think on the surface, oh, it's just because they're friends, but it's deeper than that. It's about trust, right? You don't donate to a cause unless you have some level of trust. Same with volunteering, right?
No question.
And the easiest way to trust an organization is to know and trust the leaders behind it. Because we're human. And in a sea of options, as you were saying, it's probably the fastest and easiest way to cut through the noise.
Yeah, there's no shortage of options. We talk about this with a lot of organizations as well. Talk to me about, give me your opinion about this. When everyone's always coming in and saying, hey, well, we're competing with that other event that's happening on the same weekend, or like, oh, we're going after the same. Oh, they get. And first off, we say, well, hey, you don't own your donors, by the way. They can give to multiple missions in your community or in the world for that matter, right? But we constantly preach differentiation is stronger than competition. So what sets you apart, I think, is actually a really great hallmark for an executive, director or a leader of a nonprofit or a committee member, a board member to impart, because it's that differentiation that separates them from the, charity XYZ down the street that might be, basically serving, a similar mission, right? Talk about, give us your thoughts about that.
I think there's so many layers to this. The first is knowing your target audience really well. Not every organization has the same target audience of every other organization, even if the missions are similar. You might be targeting a different demographic or age group, et cetera. So really honing in and being clear on what that is for you can make sure that your messaging and any events that you host are really well aligned to that target audience. The other thing is stepping into the shoes of the donor and remembering that when a donor gives to multiple causes, it's because they feel like that expands the good that they can do. They're not viewing it as a competition. They're trying to do as much good as possible. So if you frame it as a competition, that could be a turnoff. And I know, every nonprofit founder or leader experiences a situation where someone comes up to them and they say, well, why should I give to your cause and not to this other cause? And my response to that, especially because I was running an organization whose mission it was to mobilize volunteers to support many causes, was, look, rising tides lift all boats. We're a community. We are working to achieve these outcomes. If these are the outcomes you care about too, that's a great reason to invest in us.
More good people in the space is good for the space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a big deal. You have a very unique background, because I like to say, and I'm just using loose terms, you've sat on both sides. Now it seems like you've sat on all sides. You've been an executive director, you've been on a board, I'm assuming, several committees, you've been a volunteer, all these things. Mobilizing volunteers. What is something now that you're running your own consulting company now, correct?
Not exactly. It's, I do some consulting when there's availability, but what I'm really focused on is expanding a platform of educational content that will make social impact accessible to everyone.
Got it. And speaking and all those types of things. Yeah. Just really getting the message out there. When you come into contact with folks these days, I'm assuming you get peppered with a lot of questions?
So many questions.
Give us, let's just say, your top 3 questions that you get from nonprofit professionals these days from all different walks, as far as 2 employees, no employees. I'm just starting, maybe a multinational nonprofit. Give us like a top 3 questions that you think folks are, the audience would be asking if they had the opportunity.
Right now, I would say this question of retaining your staff and combating burnout is top of mind for so many people.
Culture.
Yeah.
Wow.
There was
Wow.
this survey,
Awesome.
gosh, I think
I
it was
love
the
it.
center.
I was not expecting
Yeah.
that. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can't do your work if you can't keep your people, right? I think
I'm with you. Yeah, I totally. We don't run a huge shop, but there's 15 of us.
there's this study that just came out from the Center for Effective Philanthropy a year or two
Hmm.
ago. They said that 95% of the nonprofit leaders that they talked to stated burnout and staff retention as their top concern. And if you've ever nerded out on papers or
I try to
surveys like
daily. I
this,
try to every day.
you know that usually the top questions are always about fundraising. How can we get more money? And that's certainly still up there. But a lot of people are thinking about this right now. And how can we balance this urgency to meet the demands and the needs of the communities that we serve with making sure that we're going to be mentally and physically okay while we do it?
Wow, it's really good. What's interesting is that we've targeted. Now that's one. We're going to get to a couple more, but I like to color outside the lines. But what's interesting is that we constantly talk to organizations where, and it's not a joke internally or anything like that, but we're understaffed, we're overworked, we're underpaid, we're well educated. We would absolutely bleed for this organization, and I hadn't heard this feedback very much. And you're right, absolutely. When you do get the opportunity to nerd out a little bit, it's always about, hey, year-end asks, and how do we maximize Giving Tuesday and peer-to-peer and this and that, which are all very important, mind you. But wow, I hadn't heard very much, and I'm glad that the conversation's happening about people being your equity.
That's right.
Because we live and breathe that internally as a for-profit organization. I think it's definitely a conversation that needs to keep happening. I think it's awesome. And thank you for uncovering it.
Absolutely.
So, and yeah, do you mimic the same thing when you, or as far as the same sentiment when you hear folks is like, we're understaffed, we're overworked. Oh my goodness. My mom works at United Way, and I was like, you're at work right now? It's like, it's 7 a.m., that kind of stuff.
Honestly, yeah. And in my nonprofit life, when I was executive director, I felt it in my bones. And, I did burn out. That's one of the contributing factors to me transitioning out of my role. Now it's just me. So, sure, I'm understaffed as just me, but
yeah,
it's also a little
a staff of one.
That's right.
Yeah. That's awesome. I started a company once with a Chromebook and a cell phone and an iPhone. So it's like, so it can be a little lonely. And then it's also true where it's like, there's times where you could create something and it can be really beautiful and it can affect a lot of people, but you can also have a very, very unhealthy relationship with it, So yeah, it's good to have that conversation for sure. Hey, hit us, it doesn't have to be more lighthearted, but hit us with some other questions that you hear on a regular basis that, like I said, the audience would be like, oh, yeah, I would ask that right now if I had the chance.
How do you get more money?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Right on. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's the first thing you say? I mean, or if you're profiling the size or what have you, is there a certain, obviously it's not one size fits all, but yeah, how do you respond to something like that?
I ask questions right back because it depends.
Totally. Yeah. You like to answer questions with questions. I do.
I have a lot of people who watch my YouTube channel, where I have, over 200 videos right now educating people on starting a nonprofit and fundraising and grants and all sorts of things.
I've seen it. It's awesome. It's an awesome resource.
Thank you. And
yeah,
when people ask me as an audience member of that channel, they're usually in a state of starting or growing. And the first thing I ask is, what's your plan to build relationships? Or do you have a lot of relationships right now? I think there's a misconception in a modern day GoFundMe world where if you just throw a fundraiser up on the internet, people are going to come and they're going to give. That's not how it works. We know, that, I know that. It's all about what are the relationships that you've already established? What level of trust and credibility have you already established that would invite people to be donors in the first place?
You said something that resonates so strongly, and I hope it does with the audience. Your relationships are your superpower. It doesn't matter how many you have, how many you're starting with, how far along you are. If you've been in the industry for 30 years or been a CEO of an organization for 30 years, people that have been successful will say the same exact thing. Your relationships are your superpower. And I think it's amazing. You also said something I haven't heard very many people say before. When it comes to fundraising, most people say ask ask, and you just said invite.
Mm.
And I actually think that that can't be overstated and or overlooked, because once you're invested in relationships, and I want you to speak to this, but it becomes less about asking and it becomes more about invitation and impact, at that point. I've only heard less than a handful of people put it that way. So very, well done.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
awesome. Speak to that a little bit, if you don't mind getting the weeds with me on that.
Well, inviting and asking can have the same outcome, and that's
100%.
obviously a goal in fundraising, but remembering that the donor gives because they are looking for an outcome, it creates a benefit for them psychologically, emotionally, etc. There's even great research out there that talks about the correlation between happiness and giving and donating and volunteering. But the other thing is, I think about this story from a nonprofit in my region. Gosh, maybe it was 10 years ago. They went under, they folded. And there was all this uproar afterwards because donors were saying, why didn't you tell us? We would have come and helped you, but you didn't even let us know what was going on. And there was
no
stress
transparency
over that. Yeah. And so if you have those relationships, it would be like not telling your friend that you need help and then having a problem because you didn't get help,
Yeah, no joke. I think that affliction affects many nonprofit professionals, correct? I mean, I've even heard some donors say, don't ever let money be the reason why we don't serve these children, or the reason why we don't build this fence around the property, or, you know what I mean? Like, I've actually heard donors, don't ever let money be that reason.
Yeah.
And it's because no one wants to see that happen. It's very interesting. There's an insecurity, a fear, a trepidation about having that conversation. Why do you think that is? From you being on the side where you were inviting people to give, and now you're coaching essentially folks on how to invite and what have you. Where does that come from? Does that come from people thinking with their own checkbooks? I'm afraid to say that we're quote unquote at risk of failing. Like, what is it? Where is that insecurity coming from, you think? Or is it just comes from many, many places?
I think that there's a modern culture of thinking of money in particular ways that it can be taboo to talk about. And speaking as someone who grew up without much of it, for the longest time, I wanted to do as much as I could in the organization, and for myself, that wasn't a healthy investment. Like my first salary as executive director, many years after working as an unpaid founder, by the way, was like $20,000, right?
Yeah.
And that's not sustainable. That's not sustainable, though. Like who can even pay their mortgage on that these days? So if you want to create impacts, you have to invest in the infrastructure and in the health of the organization. We've seen studies that show organizations that actually invest more in that infrastructure have a bigger social impact than those that skimp on it. And we have to clarify that narrative to the public.
Yeah, give some examples about the infrastructure, though, just so folks can really, really hone in on what you're talking about when you say that.
There was a study in particular of Habitat for Humanity chapters a couple of years ago. I'm not sure if you've ever seen this. I think it's published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Maybe. I'll need to look that up. But what they wanted to assess through the study was, did chapters of Habitat that invested less in what you would call overhead, what I call infrastructure and capacity, did they build more houses or did they build less houses? Because the common mythos in our public dialogue, those outside of the nonprofit sector, is this feeling of, oh, well, I want all the money to go right to the cause. But it is all going to the cause, because if you don't have infrastructure, you can't achieve your impacts.
You still have to make payroll.
Exactly. And what the study found was it was actually the Habitat for Humanity chapters that had a higher overhead percentage, aka they invested more robustly in their infrastructure. They were building a lot more houses than the chapters that weren't.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. They had their minds on growth, just like a for-profit company would. Yeah. Yeah. So often we find that I love that. I love the idea of that study. So often we find nonprofits aren't treating their organization like a real company. Like we still have to, you still have to have that conversation. We still have to make payroll. We still have overhead. We have the office. We have this. We have that. And yes, we have to serve the mission. So it is layered. It's not horribly nuanced. But how do we break that stigma of, we need to run this thing like a company. That's how we have to do it. 501c3 is a tax designation. That's as far as it goes. You know what I mean? Type thing. How do you speak to folks, I should say, about how to remove that mindset or that stigma?
I do think there are some elements of the business world we can borrow to be impactful
No
as
question.
nonprofits, but as long as we remember that our ultimate ROI is impact, right? So it's a company, but it's
absolutely.
the community's company. It's not Amber's company, right? So
right.
If we remember to frame the infrastructure and the capacity building as a strong foundation that leads to the community outcome, then I think we can wrap our brains around it and help illustrate the needs to the public and to donors. If we only focus on infrastructure for its own sake instead of connecting it to those impacts, I think that's where we cause a little bit of confusion for the general public, right?
Yeah. Makes total sense. It sounds like a conversation that you need to have early, often, and over and over and over again. And that's okay. Just a constant reminder, right? Like I think sometimes I notice this in our own company sometimes. And something I framed, I haven't always been a good manager of people. I find that sometimes when I find that I'm repeating myself over and over and over again, that's just the nature of it. That's the job, right? And then B, these things are opportunities. These moments are opportunities to have the conversation again. And at the end of the day, that's our job, right? If we're in that kind of position, but that's the privilege, I guess, that comes with that position. You know what I mean? So it seems like just like, once again, a thing that needs to be stated early, often, and over and over and over again for as many times as you need to make sure that, that if folks are reminded and then it sinks home. I think it's a great reminder. Give us something, just this is an aha thing that I've come up, I've heard so much over and over and over again. Let's just say in the last, quarter, for instance, or looking or projecting in the last quarter of the year. Kind of give us something for the audience, if you don't mind.
What I've learned, especially through YouTube, because YouTube is a bridge between people who are currently in the sector and the general public. It's a great place to discover the sector.
Good conduit. Yep. Absolutely.
What I've learned is that a basic understanding of the nonprofit sector is not very prevalent in the general world, right? It's not mainstream knowledge. And then I think because we know that the nonprofit sector employs 10% of the United States adult workforce. It's the third largest workforce in the country behind retail and manufacturing or something.
Okay. Yep.
1 in 10 people you see down the street might work for a nonprofit.
It's that way in my building. I'm in a 3-story building. Yeah. It's actually like 40%. Yeah.
Wow. But despite the pervasiveness of people in that sector, an understanding of how it all works is non-existent, right? People have perceptions, people see things on the news, but I think it's doing the sector a disservice because the more people who understand how nonprofits and social impact work in general, how it all operates, the more people who are going to be able to support and advocate and become those donors and volunteers or future leaders. And in a time when we're seeing a lot of people leave the sector due to burnout, retirement, et cetera, we really need people to understand how it works and to take an interest in it.
I love that. I think it's great. At the same time as you're seeing folks leave with burnout and culture being a huge piece of it and retention being a huge piece of the outcome, obviously, are you also noticing, or have you noticed in your experience, let's just say over the last 4 or 5 years, an injection of new talent from the for-profit sector, from traditional roles into the nonprofit space to be leaders or technology officers or marketing officers or what have you? Have you seen an injection of talent, of sound talent?
It's complicated because we see in the news and in a lot of research coming out that people are seeking jobs with meaning and purpose and where they can make a social impact overall across the board, despite sector, despite industry, especially millennials and Gen Z. Gosh, I just saw it was like 89% of millennials would reject a job if it didn't align with their social good values or something like that. So there's a lot of interest, but the problem is kind of what I was saying before. I think the nonprofit sector has a marketing problem because the interest is out there, but it might not be creating the funnels or the pathways necessary to pull that interest in. And when you put that up against a situation in which you're seeing a lot of burnout, and some of that is due to feeling like you're doing the roles of 3 people or not feeling like you're fairly compensated, you're not creating a very attractive place for these interested parties to explore. So I think there's work to do on both sides, right? There's work to do on retaining our talent and creating a social impact work environment that helps everyone thrive, but also creating those pathways to activating more change makers. And honestly, that's the side of the work that I am very interested in, and I'm going to be doing a lot more work personally going forward for myself. Yeah.
Awesome. Improving that image. Right. Yeah. Giving the sector a facelift. Well, you're doing that on your YouTube channel. Amber, do us a favor. Tell folks where they can find you the easiest. If you want them just to go straight to the YouTube channel, find you on LinkedIn, email you directly, all the above. Tell folks where they can find you with the greatest ease, if you don't mind.
I would say go to my new website, changemakercafe.com. And from there, you can find me in all of the places, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc.
All right. Awesome. Hey, appreciate you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in. Really great episode. If you get any value out of it, do us a favor, share it with someone in your network, share it with a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. We'd appreciate it. And thanks so much, Amber, once again for coming. Appreciate you.
Hey everyone. Thanks for listening. If you love our podcast, click the download button, rate us, and follow us on social media at HGA Fundraising. Get out there, start fundraising, and raise more money. See you next time.